Hi friends, if you're like me, you're a little lad who loves berries and cream. I need a haircut, or I need it to grow. I just need to stop looking like a little lad that loves berries and cream. Or you're a photographer that wants to talk about editing tricky light files. That sounds like you. We should talk. I got a message from Morlin and she wanted to know. So I had a wedding in a church last month. The pews and halfway down the walls were wooden. I had to edit to a satisfactory level, but I'm not happy with them. I'm so weak with indoor lighting. Could you put it on your list of potential videos? I can show you a few pics if you're interested to see how terrible I did. Well, I'm very interested and I decided to open it up to you guys and have you all submit files. I wanted everybody to show me the images that you were able to get in tricky lighting situations, and then I thought we could talk about them and edit them together. These are the images that she was referencing. There's this one and this one. So you didn't challenge me nearly as much as I thought you were going to. I had a situation where I walked into a space and I was like, oh no, everything's blue. And I asked the bride, like, do you want to be blue for your ceremony? And she was like, definitely not. So I told the videographer, like, hey, she doesn't want the blue lights, turn the blue lights off. I did all of the detail photos that I needed to before the ceremony, and then right before they walk out, like, everybody was seated and the videographer turned their lights on again, and this is what the room looked like. A fun house. It looked terrifying. So this is what the image looked like, and I was like, I don't know what to do with that. So I panicked. I was able to play with my HSL color stuff. You can see how much I did. Like, the oranges are all the way red and the yellows are all the way orange and the reds are like messed up, and I've taken out so many of the colors. I mostly like the magenta is all the way red. I played with these colors so much. This is how much I was able to accomplish just playing with HSL. So if you're ever dealing with really tricky DJ lights, that's a good place to start. Eventually I threw such a fit. Like, I kept going up to the planner and saying, like, please have them turn the lights off. And this is what it looked like without the DJ lights. It's like a beautiful, naturally lit, warm space. This is the straight out of the camera with my preset on it, and this is the image. But it was such a tricky situation, and most of the things that I was able to do with it was playing with the HSL stuff. And so if it's not something that you're actively doing now, I don't think the end goal always has to be perfection, but I think the HSL sliders are a great thing to go to if your wedding starts to look a little bit like Tim Burton's version of Batman in the 80s. They did the exact same thing at the reception. So this is what it looked like whenever I had the flash on, but this is the ambient lighting, and this is what I was able to do with HSL. Tricky lighting really sucks, and I definitely feel you there. I'm just gonna tell you now, there's 118 images, so I'm gonna try my best to talk as little as possible and only say the things that I think are like really helpful. I thought we would jump right in and start talking about the one that we all have the worst time with, because I got the most submissions from Dappled light, which I get. And most of the time whenever we have Dappled lighting, it's because somebody has chosen a ceremony spot or a time of day where the lighting just isn't doing what it should be doing. And I wanted to show you my worst Dappled lighting situation and how I handled it. It was this situation, and I can show you what the straight out of camera image looked like. I'm just gonna hit reset, and that's gonna default to my preset. Very challenging. Not only were they completely in the dark, and I didn't want to completely blow out the background, but also she was standing in very dappled light. Not ideal, but it's definitely not like the stark black and white that you get, because it was kind of diffused. The way that I ended up editing this, just so you can see for reference, I'm gonna put my preset on it, and then I am going to reduce the contrast quite a bit, bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows, and then I'm going to increase the exposure. I might add some vibrance and then warm it up some, since that's how I like to edit. That is roughly what I think I would do. I think ceremonies are just an it is what it is situation. If the lighting is really tricky, I just make it as little contrast as possible. And that's the same thing that I do in direct light. I have quite a few direct light images where it's just not super flattering. Again, my contrast is gonna be way down here. So I'm gonna jump into your files. There's this. This is an image that came from Adrian. I'm gonna go ahead and straighten it up. So I am going to bring down the highlights quite a bit. I'm gonna bring up the exposure a little bit, and then I'm gonna warm it up. Thing that I like to do whenever the grass is in the bright sun, I like to mess with the HSL. I'm gonna go ahead and bring the saturation down on my yellows, adjust my yellows to be a little more green, and then I'm just gonna bring that down and go back into my basic. This is going to allow me to warm up the image a little bit more without getting neon green grass, because I like to edit really warm. And especially whenever there's mixed lighting, I feel like blue toned skin looks more uncomfortable to me than skin tones that are unnaturally warm. So I'm always gonna err on the side of making it a little bit warmer. And I think that this is roughly how I would end up editing this. Bring in a linear gradient. Do I like that? I think I like that. And if you haven't updated to the newest version of Lightroom, the ability for you to take your masks and play with the amount that you've messed with is a new feature that was just released a couple days ago. This is the straight out of camera image, and this is how I would do it. All I did was hit previous on the past one, and I'm gonna bring the exposure down a little bit. I can delete this mask because I don't need that anymore. All I'm gonna do is go in here and reduce the contrast a little bit, maybe bring down the exposure, and then warm it up slightly so that everybody's just a little bit warmer. I don't mind making colors looking really irregular if it means things are gonna be slightly more flattering, even if it's less realistic. So here's the image, how I've edited it, and here's the straight out of camera image. All I've really done is warm it up and make it way less contrasty, and that's gonna be the theme of this. Here's an image that was sent to me by Brianna. This is actually an image that is out of focus, but I think it was just an example of something that she wanted to see edited. I can tell you that if I were shooting this, I would have been like, hey, let's all turn over here and just get a background with the woods, unless somebody very specifically wanted to stand in the street. This is a situation where I just would have moved them. I've seen examples in here and I'm like, I think I just would have like moved them slightly or moved myself slightly. And I think this is one of the situations where I would have done that. I think if this is an image that you really wanted to deliver, say your second shooter had taken this image, but if you bring down the highlights and bring up the exposure, flattens it out, I've taken the contrast down, and then I would warm it up so that the shadows are the least cool. And I would go into my color. You can see how the background's starting to look kind of neon. I don't like when the trees start to look like that. I'm gonna go into the greens instead of the yellows and just bring that down a little bit because we're getting quite a bit of green on her dress and I feel like it's overwhelming, but I don't want their skin to look any more pink. I don't want to add more pink to the image, so I'm just gonna remove the green specifically. Sometimes I put people in situations and I'm just like, yep, we got it, let's do one more, and then I'll move them somewhere else because I never want to say like, oh, this lighting isn't working. I will take the image, I will yes and go along with it, and then I'll retake the other image. If this is an image they really wanted and there was no way for me to just do a 180 and have me like run around on the other side and say, hey, everybody turn around and look at me. I feel like I have more control in these situations. So here are some photos that I took where I put somebody in dappled lighting, and it's just because I knew the view was gonna be epic from the side, but as Kate was walking up, hi Kate, she's a patron, she stepped into the light in a way that was really dappled. The lighting really wasn't bad here. It was kind of a diffused dapple again, which is like the ideal situation. Whenever I shot wide shots, it looked epic, and I knew as soon as they turned around, and if you can shoot in dappled lighting and just have them face in the other direction, shooting backlit with dappled lighting is the ultimate solution. So this is the other side of this. Situations where you do have control is the ideal scenario. But here's another example from you guys. We don't always have that situation, and most of these are from ceremonies. I'm gonna do the same thing here that you think I'm gonna do. I'm gonna reduce the contrast, bringing up the shadows, bring down the highlights a bit. This keeps the colors nice and saturated. I'm just gonna bring up the exposure ever so slightly, and I would edit probably based on this kind of look. And if I felt like the green was distracting from them, I might bring down the saturation of the green ever so slightly. This is how it was shot, and this is how I would edit it. So this is the exact same wedding, so I'm just gonna hit previous. I'm really just focusing on trying to get good lighting on my subjects. I feel like once I get my subjects to be lit the way that I want them to be, that's all I'm really concerned about. I think this is roughly how I would edit it. So this is the before, and this is roughly how I would edit this image. Since this is the same wedding, I'm just gonna hit previous. I think that looks really good. I have no problem with this. This is the before, this is the edit. I feel like that looks pretty good. I would be excited to deliver this. I would not be upset about the lighting at all. This looks like it's a portrait. First and foremost, raise the exposure. I'm going to color correct for it. I'm gonna add some pink because she's being lit green by all the leaves. I'm gonna warm it up, and whenever I warm it up, it's gonna turn those leaves kind of neon yellow. I'm gonna go into color, and I'm gonna make the yellow a little more green, and then subtract some of the saturation. The dappled lighting on her face is kind of the nice diffused dapple lighting, so it really doesn't bother me that much. Take out some of the purple. I feel like there's purple in the hair. Yeah, see the hair? I'm like slightly changing it. I'm gonna make it a little bit more blue. This is what we started with, and this is what we have. I don't feel like this lighting is particularly tricky. Once I raised the exposure, I felt like it all came together really nicely. Here's another one where we're dealing with some dappled lighting, and it is pretty harsh dappled lighting. We're getting some like blown out bright spots. So in these situations, you always wanna try to make sure that you are exposing for the highlights, because you can usually get more information out of the shadows than you can the highlights. So I'm gonna start by trying to see how much we have in the highlights. highlights. I'm gonna bring down and then bring up the shadows a little bit more. And then I'm gonna go ahead and increase the exposure, and I'm gonna warm this up because her dress right now is blue. As we do that, it turns kind of green. I'm gonna add some pink, bring the highlights up a little bit. It is doing funky things to the suit colors, so I'm just gonna go into my HSL and I'm gonna play with the saturation of, I'm gonna get rid of some of the yellows because those are turning really neon really quickly for me. Anytime the sun hits leaves, it just turns them a little bit more saturated. Anytime there's lighting that is directly lighting anything, like her skin here looks super saturated because we have direct light. So anytime there's direct lighting hitting anything, it's gonna be more saturated. If you wanted to, you can go in Photoshop and soften all of the hard lines just by creating a 10% flow in a clone brush and just keep sampling and putting these back together. This is not a thing that I would probably do to client images, but if you were more of a stickler than me, this is an option and this is how you would do it. So I really loved seeing images like this because I literally just shot that exact situation the other day. I would take my contrast pretty much all the way down, highlights pretty much all the way down, shadows quite a bit up, and then I would bring up my vibrance, and there is a good chance that I would need to bring up the exposure, warm it up, add some green, maybe warm it up a little bit more, take down the highlights, shadows. This is roughly how I would tend to edit this. And what's nice about whenever I edit things at super low contrast is that I'm gonna have an added layer of making everything look cohesive because I'm gonna run everything through Alien Skin, because after this, I export things into Alien Skin, and this is what the final result ends up looking like. Pretty desaturated, but this is just the way that I tend to edit. So this is my before, this is my after. So in situations like this, I would very much be trying to do the same thing. I would reduce the contrast, the highlights, bring up the exposure a bit. I would bring up the shadows even more, and maybe bring down the exposure. I think the tricky thing here is going to be getting rid of some of the saturation that's happening as a result of this being in the sun and in the shadow. I'm gonna warm it up a little bit more, bring up the exposure, and I'm going to go to color, and I'm just gonna take some of this green down so that it's less neon. I feel like whenever I do that, it automatically brings a little bit more cohesion to the shadows and the highlights. You don't have to necessarily bring it down that much, but this is probably how I would do it. This is what our before looks like, this is what our after looks like. It's how the wedding day happened, and it's a lot softer than how the image looked previously. This one's pretty tricky because everybody's in the shadows. I'm just gonna reduce the contrast first and foremost, bring down the highlights, and bring up the shadows. I'm going to increase the vibrance just a bit, and then bring up the exposure. And I think the only thing that we're gonna be able to do here, I'm gonna add some warmth, is maybe add a linear gradient and bring down the exposure on some of the audience. I might add some shadows back in, add some contrast back in, maybe subtract the contrast. I think this is just gonna be an issue where I just have to like fiddle with it a little bit to see if I can get it to look okay. But I think this is really gonna be another like it is what it is kind of day. Add some temperature. I'm gonna make the tree a little darker, so I'm gonna create a new mask and linear gradient and just bring that down, because what I want to do is create a little bit more darkness around them since they are the darkest part. This is the straight out of camera image. This is just going to be a situation where it is what it is, and I think in this situation what I would really focus on is take the wide shot, edit the best you can, and then really just try to work your angles as you're shooting the ceremony. I have an example here where the light was so direct, and shooting kind of off to the side was not flattering for literally either of them. So I ended up trying to shoot mostly kind of like behind them, so that way they were being backlit. This would be the same with dappled lighting. You really want to get behind people when there's dappled lighting so that it's not hitting them on the face, but it's hitting them on their shoulders behind them. So that was how I ended up shooting it. This is what it looks like when I'm shooting it from the side slash front. And this is the lighting whenever I'm just standing behind them. These were taken at the exact same time. I'm just changing my angle, and I think that that should really be the goal anytime there's a tricky ceremony situation. You can't always do that. That's not always an option, but I just wanted to bring it up because I was having a hard time shooting both of them, but just by getting behind them a little bit, I was able to change up the lighting enough to get a couple more flattering images, even though I couldn't hang out there the entire time. That being said, This is a really tricky wedding where there might not be a great angle or way for you to kind of get behind them. So I'm gonna do, surprise, surprise, the same thing that I've been doing with dappled lighting. I'm gonna bring down the contrast almost all the way because this lighting is very extreme. I'm gonna bring down the highlights quite a bit, and then I'm gonna bring up the shadows. And then what I'm really gonna wanna play with here is the temperature a little bit. He is starting to get a blue suit already, so I'm gonna go into color and I'm gonna start playing with the yellow because his face is turning kind of a bright yellow color. I'm gonna make it a little bit more orange because it's skin that's mostly being affected, and then I'm gonna bring down the saturation just a bit. I'm gonna bring up the exposure slightly, bring down the highlights ever so much. And it's still gonna be harsh lighting, it's still gonna be really tricky, but this is what we started with, and this is the end result whenever we played with the contrast. Again, this is my base preset. This is what it looks like straight out of camera. So the preset that I have is already a little bit low contrast, and I just wanna make it even more low contrast from there. I would apply this exact same preset to this image. This is the straight out of camera image. This is my base preset. And this is how I edited the other ceremony shot, and I'm just gonna recrop it just a little bit. And I might actually bring back some of those highlights and bring in a little bit more contrast. Since we're a little bit closer, I feel like it can handle the contrast a little bit better. So I'm just gonna hit previous again. I'm gonna reset, straighten, and for images that are far away, I feel like they can take a little bit more bad lighting. I'm gonna bring the exposure down because I think what's really cool and unique about this ceremony is that you get to see all the blue in the background. So I'm gonna bring down the highlights a little bit more, add some pink because I feel like their suits will look a little green, add some warmth, bring down the exposure. That's probably roughly how I would edit this ceremony shot. I'm gonna hit reset and bring it back. And I feel like this level of consistency really works across the board for all three of these images. So there was only one image that was sent to me that it used a flash during a ceremony, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about that just for a second. This was a flash that was used during a ceremony. The bounce flash was never gonna work in this situation. You can tell that the only people that got illuminated in this photo were the people that were sitting in the back row here, and they absorbed all the light. If you got closer, then I think you definitely could have used a flash. This is a situation where I really needed to use a flash during the ceremony because the light was really tricky. And so I did not have a flash on here. I did have one on here. I didn't think it was the most flattering thing. It did start to look more flattering as I got a little bit closer and as I brought the ISO down a little bit more, so that way my flash was more of the main light source than the hot light that was on her head. So this was taken at 1.2 and this was taken at 1.4. So just by closing down a little bit, I was able to make my flash more of the main light source instead of the ambient light, and because I got closer, they were receiving more of the flash. But this is what it looked like when I was not using flash at this ceremony. It was not great. So sometimes if you can use flash and you are comfortable with it, you can definitely use flash during ceremonies. I will just say that whenever you need to break out your flash during a ceremony, it's usually because you need to cancel out some of the lighting that's happening. And so you need to be closer, have a flash that's strong enough to take it. And in this situation, I think that the only thing that you could have done is just work with the ambient light. I think they probably would have been silhouetted or the background would have been totally blown out. So for this, I feel like it was just a matter of like shooting it differently, but if I were to edit this, I'm gonna edit it for the people in the background. I'm going to crop this a little because I need to get rid of all the bright people in the background, and I'm gonna try to edit for their skin tone. I think it just would have been like an it is what it is situation. I'm adding green, I'm increasing it. Hopefully you can see what my sliders are doing or see what's happening on the screen. I'm gonna bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows, and this isn't an ideal situation, but I think that we've made it a little bit worse by introducing a blue flash into a purple image. So I think for the ceremony, I just would have ended up shooting ambient and trying to get up at the front and sort of shooting off to the side the way I was talking about it here, because our light source in that image was really coming from the back, which is something that I talked about in a lighting video. We really want to front light people with soft light and we want to backlight people with harsh light. I hope that helps. I also received images like this that took place in churches, and I can show you how I would edit this image as I had it. I'm going to grab my little dropper. You can also hit W. I'm gonna just grab some white off this guy's shirt and I'm gonna bring up the exposure. I'm gonna drop the contrast. I'm gonna bring down the highlight. I'm gonna bring up the shadows a little bit. This isn't gonna be as drastic as we were when we were outside, but the lighting is pretty unflattering. I'm gonna bring up the exposure, make it a little green. It's too much. Make it a little warm. I think that looks okay. and then I would center frame it. But the thing is that this lighting is directly overhead, and this is like shooting at noon lighting, which is really, really difficult to deal with. So what I would have done is use flash. So if I'm shooting at a church and I'm doing any kind of formals where flash is allowed, and typically flash is allowed during the formals, I will put a flash on and just fire at full power and just try to bounce off anything that's at the church. The ceilings, the columns. I'll have a second shooter stand there with a piece of paper if that's the only way that I can get some light for it to bounce off of. This is an image where the background is blown out, and you can see they're very much being lit by the side and by the back. By putting on a flash and shooting in that exact same situation, I am bouncing off something in the church, and I'm able to get the flash back onto them, and it's able to balance out the lighting in the image, and I feel like this looks a lot more flattering as a result. This is the before, this is the after. This is a situation where I think that a flash is just necessary, and I can show you a couple examples of that. Here's an ambient light photo, here's a flash photo, and here's what it looks like in a group setting. It's definitely warmer in the background. We talked about using gels and how gels will make everything look the same color. I don't mind when the background is warm, and so I'm not using gels in this circumstance. But since I received this image that did have flash used, what I really noticed was that the flash was used, but the ambient lighting was still too bright. I think this was also taken with like a 100mm lens, and so for this image, it might just be that the flash wasn't powerful enough to reach them to light them properly. If it was possible, I would have used something like a 50 or an 85 at the most. It's really hard to use flash with longer lenses, I think. So for this image, I can show you how I would edit it. I would grab my little color picker, click some white, straighten it out, bring up the exposure, make it a little green. That's too much. I'm just gonna micro adjust it and make it a little warm. And then I think I would take some of the yellow out of the background just so that it brings more of the warmth onto them. And I think that that is roughly how I would edit this, but I think the ideal situation here would have been to use a more powerful flash setting or to use a lower ISO to bring down the ambient lighting in the back, so that way we're getting more lighting from the flash. This one did not use a flash, but this is a circumstance where I would absolutely have brought a flash into the mix. It can make such a big difference. Here's an example inside of a tent where my flash just didn't fire. This is the flash not firing. Here's the flash firing. But anytime we are in a lighting situation where we have the option to do any kind of bounce flash, I will definitely bring bounce flash into the mix. And since it seems like it was a church, this is a situation much like this one where things aren't being lit great, and we would want to bring a flash into the mix. I'm gonna grab my color picker, hit W. I'm gonna grab some neutrality from the dress. It looks like there is blue lighting on the side and tungsten lighting above. I'm just gonna bring it up. I'm gonna warm it up and reduce the contrast. I'm gonna reduce the highlights a bit, bring down the exposure. I'm going to go in and just start playing with my HSL. So I'm going to take out some of the orange because the floor is looking very neon. My people are starting to look a little zombified. They're wearing blue dresses because normally when there's blue, I'm like, I'm gonna take out the blue from the side. I think for this, I can go to select subject. Hopefully it'll just get everybody, hit invert, and then I'm gonna warm up the background a little bit. Just a bit on that side. I think that's how I would do it. I'm gonna zoom in. Again, they're being lit directly overhead. This is really a good circumstance to try to bring in a flash. I'm gonna bring up my shadows just a bit and exposure just a little bit more. I would say I'm gonna go to my yellows and make them a little bit greener, and then take the yellows down. We can see that the yellow light from overhead is really creating like kind of a green cast. I'm just gonna take some of that out. And then I have a little preset for high ISO that I've talked about before. I'm just gonna hit the ISO, and this is roughly how I would edit this. This is a situation where I think I would have shot it differently. I would have shot it with bounce flash, but this is the before. And this is the after. I think if you wanted to, you could bring down the exposure just a little bit, but this is ultimately how I would have taken this image if, say, a second shooter had shot it and I didn't have control over it. This is how I would have edited it. Something that I haven't really talked about much on here is how often I use video lights. I do use video lights quite a bit during receptions, and I am definitely happy to talk about that more if that's something you guys want to hear about, but I'm gonna talk about how video lights could have saved a lot of the photos that we're gonna look at in the video light category, which is something special that I've put together just because I was like, like, I would have used a video light. There are circumstances like this where flash was not used. I definitely think that I would have been using flash in this situation. I do have an image here that I took where I had similar lighting. I brought in a video light that you can see off to the left here, and whenever I used bounce flash in the tent, the video light was just sort of like this nice light that I had in the background. For this image, I'm gonna go to develop. I'm gonna grab some white, and I'm going to bring up my exposure. Let's see, the tent's all the way down. I'm gonna warm it up a little bit, bring down the exposure, and then I'm gonna hit my HSLs, and I'm gonna start playing. Okay, so I think this is roughly how I would edit this image. Biggest things that I went in and played with was the magenta. I just made it all the way red. I was just watching the skin tones and moving the sliders around to try to get them all to look right. She had a bright red hand, so I made it orange. The hue was way too purple, so I made it more red. I was just going in and adjusting things and seeing what looked right. I will say that this is a situation where I probably would have wanted to use either a video light or a flash, but this was the before and this is the after. And if I turn off just the HSLs, you can see the biggest difference that it's made. I have mostly desaturated a lot of the colors, but this is an option where you can get things looking more normal instead of just turning it to black and white. I had a wedding where they didn't have purple uplighting, but they had this like bright orange. And so it definitely throws off your editing in a way where you're not able to bring back all the information. This is what the image looked like straight out of camera. This is the only way that I was able to edit it. For this one, again, I just went in and I just desaturated and played with all the color sliders as much as possible to try to make it look normal. It looked fine whenever I used bounce flash, but you could see it made the entire room like dark red. So it was really vibrant colors. So bounce flash was definitely the way to go this day. Yeah, that uplighting is a beast. This is another situation where I think I would have gotten my video light out, put it on a light stand, and I would have like lit little areas instead of only shooting details without lighting, but I can show you how to edit it now. I'm gonna grab my color slider and I'm just gonna pick an area. The tabletop makes everything look too blue. I'm gonna pick the blue side. I feel like that looks okay. I would feel much more comfortable taking some of the yellow out that's happening there. I think if I didn't want to make it look like, oh, that's not what my wedding looked like, I could probably cool it down a little bit and bring in a little bit more purple. But I don't want it to be like a neon color. That's just, it's not the vibe. I'm gonna take out a little bit of the orange, and then I think I'm gonna raise the shadows up some and bring down the highlights and bring down the exposure. So I think for this image, I probably would have been another opportunity for me to bring in the video light, but I think the way that I would end up editing it is roughly like this. This is what it looked like straight out of camera. This is probably how I would edit it. Again, I'm just kind of desaturating it because I want it to be consistent more or less with the rest of the day, and I also want it to look consistent with how it would look whenever I'm shooting bounce flash. This is the same setting. I'm gonna hit previous on that, and it roughly just made it look like a really nice, warm, neutral palette. If that feels too far removed from their wedding colors, you could definitely bring back in more of the purples and more of the warmth. I feel like that's the before and that's the after. I still feel like that represents something that doesn't feel like it's naturally colored without being over the top. Here's a situation that we are all too familiar with. I think this is a direct flash image that was taken of the toast, and I will say that I don't recommend direct flash for the toast. I think that direct flash is great for portraits, and I think it's great for whenever you're outside and you don't have any options. It does look like the ceiling was painted black, so this is a situation where it might have felt like I can't use bounce flash here. So I wanted to introduce how I use video light during toast. So both of these images were taken using video lights, and I can show you what that looks like. This was a video light that the videographer had set up over here that is illuminating her face, and this guy is being lit by this video light. This is a situation where I literally just flopped a video light on the ground in the middle of everything, and I was just fine with it. And videographers do it all the time, so I feel like we can do it sometimes too. This is another speech situation where, again, I just set up the video light, and you can see my video light up here on a stand, and You can also see the lighting in the background over here. People were purple, so I really needed to bring in my own lighting for these speeches because I didn't want to use bounce flash the entire time. Toasters don't really move, so it's really easy for me to just set up a video light and forget about it. And that being said, if I was going to edit this image, I would straighten it up, probably crop it a little bit. I would have waited for him to sort of like look in my direction, but I'm just gonna increase the exposure, make it a little bit more green, and I think beyond that, this is really like a situation where it just wasn't being lit the way that I needed it to be, and he just wasn't looking the way that I would have wanted him to look. I feel like if we had waited for him to slightly look at the camera, had a slightly different expression, or lit it differently, then I think that this image would have been a lot more successful. I feel like just editing it, it's really not a bad edit. It's just that the posing situation and the location called for something that was slightly different. I got one image from this photographer and I wanted to compare it to an image that I had taken in a lighting situation that was really tricky. So these are two images that were taken in like different lighting, but kind of the same lighting situation. Really strong backlighting, really dark in front, and I'm going to edit mine first. I've already done the color editing because this is what my image looked like straight out of camera. So what I did for my image was I increased the exposure, and that was roughly all that I needed to do. We were both shooting with 24 millimeters. Hers was shot at 2.8, and I actually did like an equivalency calculator. Hers was like a stop and a third darker than mine, and I feel like hers could have been lit brighter than mine since mine was like an almost pitch black room. So I think what I would have done here is, I think the ISO is fine. I think I probably would have shot it at like maybe 2/50th of a second and maybe close down my aperture if that's an option on the lens that you were shooting on to maybe a 2.0 or 1.8 if possible. Because I think what we ended up doing was we didn't have enough information in the shadows because this is a 5D Mark III, which doesn't hold as much information in the higher ISOs as before. But if I were to edit this, I would make it a bit brighter. She's got this green cast on her. I don't see any green in this picture that I'm like so in love with that I'm like not prepared to get rid of it. So I'm gonna make it more yellow and then I'm gonna desaturate it. Again, I don't care about keeping things looking the way that they're supposed to. I'm just trying to make it look good. I would probably go into detail and take out some of the noise. We can see it's really noisy. And then I like to add noise again. Like I like to add green in alien skin. So I overly smooth things out in Lightroom and then I add in grain later. I'm gonna increase the exposure a little bit. I'm gonna increase my shadows and bring the highlights down. And I think this is roughly how I would edit this image. The before and this is the after. It's still quite a bit grainy, but we have gotten rid of the green cast on her. I could even go into my yellows if I wanted to and take out a little bit more of the yellow. But I think this is roughly how I would do it. I think that this is a situation where you had to change your settings really, really quickly because it was changing so drastically from the back to the front. Whenever you're shooting people walking down an aisle, 2/50th of a second is probably fine. I would have mostly worked with just changing my ISO. I tend to mostly change my ISO whenever I'm moving through a space. And I know we didn't have the option to use the flash here, but I would grab the color, bring up the exposure a bit, warm it up, reduce the contrast, bring down the highlights, bring down the exposure. We can't really take the blue out of this image since it is predominantly in the suits, but if that man was not wearing a blue suit, you better believe that I would take the HSL and just take the blue out. Yeah, I think I would do that. And then I think I'm gonna go in and take out a little bit of the yellow and then take out just a little bit of the orange. This is the before, this is the after, and I really feel like this is a better alternative to just making things black and white. So the last 4 images that I have, I felt like weren't even tricky lighting. I am happy to edit them, but I don't think that they are tricky. I think that this is like a really nice overcast day. I'd probably grab my color picker, pick some white, brighten it up, maybe bring down the highlights a little bit. But I feel like this is lovely. This is nice, even soft lighting. I don't have a problem with it. This is how I would deliver this image. I feel like this looks good. This is another one where I was like, what? This looks good. I have no problem with this. I might bring up the exposure a little bit, but this looks like a beautiful ad. I have no problems with this at all. I think no notes. This looks fine with my base preset on it. This is an image that when I saw it, I was like, I can see the problem here. And I think that we can see by the light that's happening on the top of his shoulders that the light is probably either directly overhead or maybe we are facing something that's a little bit dark. If there's no way to get him to turn around, then I would have backed him up to something dark, because if we can't add light in front of somebody, then we want to take away light from behind. And this is something that I talk about in an overcast / bad lighting video that I've done. I'm gonna recrop this a little bit and just try to edit it to the best of my ability. I'm gonna bring up the shadows a little bit and bring up the exposure and bring down the contrast. And I think since these two images are roughly from the same set, I'm just gonna try to make them match skin tone wise as much as possible. I think that this is the best that we're gonna get, trying to get these two to match. I think that it's lovely. I think that since her image is so soft, I'm gonna take that yellow because it's turning kind of neon, and I'm just gonna make it more green and desaturate it. And I feel like that is how I would edit those two images together. I feel like I just want the lighting to be a little bit different on him. This is another image where I was like, this lighting is fine. So I think for this image, all I would do is straighten it. It really bothers me that they're not centered. I feel like the lighting isn't the thing that bothers me here. I really want their feet to not be cropped. But if I was going to edit this, I think I'm gonna bring it up a little bit more and just crop it ever so different. I think I would maybe bring up the exposure a little bit, maybe add a little bit of contrast to it, maybe bring down the temperature. Ultimately, I feel like the lighting really isn't problematic here. It's like pretty flattering on her. I don't think that I would necessarily even go in like add a mask or anything. I feel like this is a fairly evenly lit image. Since I would be working with ambient light, this is how I would edit it. I don't know that I would have even used flash in this situation because we have two very soft light sources happening on either side. So I know this was long, but I really hope this was helpful. I loved your examples, and it's really nice to see that we all kind of deal with the exact same thing over and over. Dappled lighting during ceremonies, a real problem. DJs bringing in weird lighting to receptions, a real problem. And situations where bounce flash is really difficult, but we still need to do those reception photos. Very relatable. So Kate's wedding specifically was one where I shot and I didn't use flash. This is just using 3 different video lights and the string lights that were happening there. You definitely have sweet spots whenever you're using video lights, but they can be really helpful in situations where bounce flash just isn't working. So I really hope this helps. Thank you guys so much for sending in your examples. It was so great to see your work. I hope this was helpful. If you want me to talk about video lights in the future or anything else, definitely let me know. As you can see, whenever you guys make suggestions, I take them very seriously. And it means so much to me whenever you guys ask me questions. So thank you for being here, and I will talk to you soon. All right, bye.